Good morning and welcome to Finding Emotional Freedom, hosted by Dave Jetson. Dave graduated in 2000 from NAU with a bachelor's degree in applied management and earned his master's degree in counseling from South Dakota State University. Dave is the founder of Jetson Consulting and Living True. He has over 10 years experience as a professional mental health counselor and speaker. Dave currently leads individual and group counseling and workshops on many different topics. He is also one of a limited number of individuals in the country who are trained to help others explore and heal money issues. He has developed the Financial Therapy Program Workshop, in which he helps participants address their thoughts and feelings regarding complex money issues. Today, Dave will discuss finding emotional freedom, accessing the truth your brain already knows, referencing his book by the same name. Welcome, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tammy. People ask me many times, why did I get a bachelor's degree in business? And the reason I did is because I knew I wanted to get into private practice and counseling. And I felt it would be very helpful and beneficial to understand the business model before I got into my private practice. I have found it being very helpful and strategic in my practice and also in what I do. That being said, that's helped me with the financial therapy piece in many different ways. It also has helped me be more responsive to the needs of the people and myself as I developed the practice. I was asked to write the book, Finding Emotional Freedom, from my clients. What was interesting is when I would be working with my clients, I would talk to them about many different things, and they said, what book can we find this information? And what I found is that I couldn't find a book. The information that I had gathered was information that I actually got from my clients as they would do their work. That was the impetus of writing this book. As I shared with Tammy, I do not like to write. I have dyslexia and it's not my strength. So I used a ghostwriter to write the book, which has been very helpful in my writing because the information I've been able to just share and then it's been put on paper. That being said, like I say, the impetus of this book was actually observing patterns with my clients. What will be interesting is that there are definitely patterns that have been consistent that people exude in trauma. For example, I don't care who we are, we all have emotional trauma. It can be as huge as nearly escaping a situation with our life. It can be as small as being asked to stop crying. If we do not deal with the feelings, feel them, give them an emotional voice and release them, they get stuck in our body as emotional trauma that negatively impacts every decision we make. And people say, well, why do I change this? Self-help books, that type of thing. Why they sound great and that sort of thing, but why don't they create the change? The reason is we are creatures of habit and we do what's familiar. Even if the familiar is unhealthy for us, we are going to seek what's familiar. It's amazing to me how many clients I have worked with through the years that are terrified of a compliment. They cannot receive it. And the reason is because their history doesn't have compliments associated with it. It's all been criticism. And so their familiar is the criticism. When we work with people on this trauma, it's about helping them walk through the familiar and getting them to feel the change of something that would be more helpful and effective. I consistently have seen where people want to create the change, and the fear of change prevents them from moving forward. Now, there's a reason for this, and what's interesting is when I first got into the counseling practice, I heard about the conscious brain and the inner child. What I consistently found is that there is this other part I call the trauma child. what's interesting is in my profession, there are a number of people talk about us having 3 brains today with brain scans and that type of thing. There's a lot of information out there that really dictates that we have 3 brains. So basically working in tandem with them when they work right or when there's trauma in opposition with each other. So anyway, if this were my fist were the brain, the largest part's the cerebrum, the surface of is called the cerebral cortex. In the prefrontal area of the cerebral cortex with brain scans, they've been able to determine that that's where our conscious brain resides. Now, the conscious brain is involved in about 2 million pieces of information a second. And we consider that that's not a bit or a byte like a computer. That's a lot of information. The thumb represents the limbic system. It's the oldest, most archaic part of the brain. It's right at the top of the brain stem. It's where our fight, flight, and freeze syndrome resides. And it's also where all of our true feelings reside, because our true feelings are actually nothing more than a defense mechanism designed to protect us. What's interesting is we have been taught to hide our emotional truth. Now, you think that's really counterintuitive when you realize that that's our natural defense mechanism, and it is. But in the wisdom through the centuries, our parents have learned we're supposed to hide our feelings. I will tell you, the hiding of our true feelings creates all the chaos in our life. What happens is that there's another part of the brain on both sides of the limbic system called the insular cortex. It has its finger on the pulse of our true feelings. It also has special nerves called spindle nerves that get us moving and moving forward before our conscious brain has been able to engage to make a decision. What's interesting is there's a YouTube video I watched a few years ago, and it was about people pushing a button with either the left hand or right hand. The subconscious brain knew 6 to 7 seconds prior to the button being pushed which button would be pushed. I explain it this way is that our subconscious, our insular cortex has got us moving and that sort of thing, and our conscious is trying to come up with excuses to explain why we just did what we did. I have labeled the limbic system as our inner child, because that's where our truth is. That's the core essence of who we are and what's about, and that's our true innocent part of the brain. The insular cortex I call the trauma child, because it's where all the trauma and the chaos gets created. It's also, when we're on autopilot, it's the one that's in charge. And so when we want to create change, it requires us to take more time to connect with our emotional truth to really create the change. Bessel van der Kolk's a premier researcher in trauma, and one of the things he talks about is you can talk to your blue in the face and you make minor changes, but to really make change, it means to go into our subconscious, into our true feelings in order to connect with our emotional truth. When we do that, that's when we can create change. It's like resetting the emotional tape in the limbic system that also resets the counter tape in the insular cortex. That's when the true change comes. Most people can do behavioral changes and this sort of thing in order to modify behaviors. This is where cross addictions occur, that type of thing, because the core issue has never been addressed and resolved. And so when I wrote this book, these are the patterns that I was seeing. These are the issues that I found to be a big issue. How do we help people connect with what their true feelings in order to create the reset? Talk therapy only will get you so far. And quite frankly, it's not the most effective way. In fact, it's not really all that effective in creating the change. So the question is what does create the change? And that's going back into feeling our true feelings, giving them the voice and resetting them. As I mentioned earlier, our conscious brain is involved in about 2 million pieces of information a second. The research is showing our subconscious brain, where the insular cortex and limbic system and other parts of the brain they're involved in over 4 billion pieces of information a second. Now, so it's about a 2,000 to 1 ratio. The research is also showing when it comes to actual decision making, our conscious brain is only involved in between 1% and 9% of every decision we make. It's amazing how many people will come in and, talking about what, I've been trying to figure this out for years. And, I'm saying, you're a bright person. If you could figure it out, you'd have done it already. I consistently see that. This is not something, when you want to create the change, lasting change, it's not about figuring it out. You will never figure it out. You have to feel it out. It's a different part. And so people that want to stay in the logical part of the brain really have a difficult time moving forward with this. And when we look at the conscious part of the brain, while most of us want to live in that part, it isn't the part that really works. And so when I work with people, what we do is we do a lot more of experiential type work. We'll do interacting with different things. The goal is to help people feel it in the subconscious part of the brain, because that's what helps creates the change more effectively. And so how do we do that? A lot of people talk about, with self-help books, I tell myself 100 times that, I'm going to be a happy person, I'm going to be happy. I've only heard like a couple people that's ever said that was really helpful or effective. And the reason is that you're still using your conscious brain. The conscious brain is not the one that's creating the issues, and it's also not the one that's going to create the change. When the subconscious gets reset, that's when everything gets in alignment. Now the question is how does all this start and where? The way this starts goes back to our infancy. What I mean by that is we are taught not to feel at a very young age. I mean, when we first come home from the hospital and mom or dad says, "Oh, please stop crying," that's the first lesson of having us disconnect from our true feelings. Now, I share that because, I did that. You did that, I'm sure, as a parent. We've all done that. And I've told my kids that I'm going to pay for their first treatment program to work through those issues because I know that it's not helpful or effective. What I did in teaching them not to feel. And so what's interesting is as a child, our parents are like God to us, and we want to believe everything they say. And so we do. And when we're taught not to feel, we're taught to emotionally disconnect from us. And this is where the evolution of codependency starts. For those that are not familiar with codependency in a generic perspective is that we place everybody else's needs in front of our own and make everything more important about them than ourselves. And deep down inside, we might have a little bit of resentment, or we might have a little bit of resentment, meaning a lot of resentment around that, taking care of other people. And it comes out in many, many different ways. So with that, when we first start to learn how to hide our emotional truth, hide our feelings, that's when codependency starts. And that's when other things start. That's when we emotionally abandon ourselves. That's a huge issue. And it's interesting how many people feel lonely, even if they're in a crowd of people. This is not about that. It's because we've emotionally disconnected from ourselves. Additionally, when we're taught not to feel with many different messages, and we could rattle off many, what's interesting is the feelings are still there. So, subconsciously, we might be running through, there must be something wrong with me because I'm still feeling these feelings, and mom and dad are telling me I'm not supposed to feel them. That's where guilt starts. I must be bad because these feelings are still there. That's shame. What's interesting is with any and every addiction, there are four core pieces that people are dealing with that create the addiction. And that's codependency, abandonment, guilt, and shame. And they're all started when we're taught not to feel. Now, when we get into it, we can talk about the negative self-talk. How many of you beat yourself up, your own worst critic? Well, how that happens, every message that we are born with is always loving and honoring, respectful of ourselves. Every criticism that we tell ourselves, in some way, shape, or form, we've been taught. Now, when we were taught it, it was a lie. We may have made it become reality through our words and our actions as time has gone on. But for the most part, they're still lies. This is one of the things that I work quite extensively with people is where did those messages originate? Why did it happen? And how? An example is I had this lady who was extremely overweight. And when she came in, she wanted to focus on her weight. Well, what I found is focusing on her weight just gave her more guilt and shame. We focused in a different perspective that actually allowed her to lose some weight for the first time, and she said in 23 years. But we never focused on her weight. We focused on her trauma. That was a different issue. But in the course of this, she had the message that she was fat. So I asked where she learned that message, and she had a very clear message. She was about 6 years old, and mom bought her a new dress, and she was walking down the stairway, and dad looked up at her and says, "You look fat in that dress." That was where she learned the message. Now, you say it's very innocent, and this is what's really interesting is that how a child interprets messages has long-lasting impacts on the way we see the world, how we perceive others, how we perceive ourselves. And so what's interesting is some of the negative messages we may have received, we received verbally. Some we may have received with a glare, a glance, a cold shoulder, being ignored, being abandoned. There are many ways we learn these negative messages. In most of them, as parents, we never intended to give those messages. That's why a lot of this work is very deep and difficult for people to really comprehend and understand until we create a safe environment that allows this stuff to come forward. And so what I have found is to really work on this. It's really about how do we create a place of trust and safety to look at this stuff very openly and objectively. That's the first piece for change. The second piece, once we have that, is to start being able to connect emotionally. What I have found is many people want to learn their story and they say, well, we can't look at this because I have no memory of it. I will tell you, most of the work that I have done with people, there is no memory. Because the way our body protects ourselves is to shut down when it's real severe trauma. And so if we've had real severe trauma, we might not remember any of it, yet our body does. And so this is a process of where we work at the emotional level to validate the feelings. We can work through and create change in the validation of the feelings rather than having the story. And that's an important piece. to recognize. I will tell you, I put a little piece of my story in the book. I had a lot of trauma, and what I found is I have very few memories. Most of the memories that I have today are actually what was told to me by friends, relatives, siblings, whoever that let me know what happened. The point of the matter is that the emotions that are there are still alive, impacting our lives. And that's the piece that I have found in working with people is how do we connect at that emotional level in order to create the change. So when people are ready, this is where I do what I call the intuitive experiential therapy. The reason I call it intuitive is because when it comes to interacting with people, research is showing is that about 90% of all communication is nonverbal. So when I work with people, it's about helping them connect with their nonverbals. It's amazing how many come in and say, you got to fix me. And I say, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to guide. My guide is to help you connect and see and feel what your body is actually saying. And it's in that process that we can actually connect with these feelings, give them an emotional voice, and release them, which creates the change. And so a lot of the things that I like to work with people on is to create that environment to do those type of things. Now, when it comes to this, the obstacles to change are fear is the hugest issue. Fear of creating change, fear that what I'm looking at didn't happen, fear that I might say something wrong, do something wrong, fear of looking at the pain that I've been hiding in my body for years can be terrifying. And so that's a huge piece. Another piece is codependency. If I'm in a relationship, like if I'm very enmeshed with my family of origin and some of the issues that I want to work with around my family of origin, it's going to be very difficult to do that. One of the things that I have worked with people on is to help them see is that when we work on this, it's not about tearing up our parents. I've seen many people who want to lambaste their parents and that sort of thing. I don't believe that's helpful or healthy. What I think is really important to recognize is that every parent has wonderful qualities about them. And every parent has done something to hurt their children. And when I work with people, it's about looking at the parts of the parent that have hurt them while maintaining the parts of the parent that are very loving, caring, respectful, and special. And so the process is maintaining that integrity and helping them feel safe. It's interesting I invite people to trust the process. Now, I find that people will ask, well, what is the process? And this is where I say it means that we need to trust God. Because what we're doing, what we're exploring, how we're getting there is bigger than you and I together. I do not know what to do. You do not know what to do. But when we are able to work together, something bigger than us gets involved. That's what I consistently see. It was interesting. I had an atheist once in one of my workshops. At the end of the workshop said, I want to thank you because for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a spirituality. And what was interesting is in that workshop, I never talked about God. I gave her the opportunity to feel it. And that's the piece that I think is really important in this process is how do I give myself permission to trust something bigger than myself to help walk through the change process. Now, in that process, another piece that's helpful and important is to have a support system. When we're dealing with trauma and that sort of thing, we received it many times on our own. We're taught not to tell anybody about the trauma, or we got to look good for everybody when we go downtown. if you will. What's important is that in the recovery process, it's important that you do not have to do it on your own. And it really doesn't work when you do it on your own. Because all it does is when we try to ruminate about it in our heads and process it in our heads, it just stays in our heads. It's really about how do we get it out? And how do we have a support system that can really be helpful and effective? This is where 12-step groups can be helpful if it's a good, healthy group, and it might not be the whole group, but that might be 1 or 2 people in that group that can be really helpful. It's about how do we find those people? How do we find the people that we can share our story with and they share their stories with us so that we have a mutually respectful, growing relationship that actually helps create change? Now, I'm giving lots of information here. I have much more information, but I think it's important to open up for any questions at this point in time so that if there's a specific direction that might be helpful, that we can go in that direction. So at that point, with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions you may have.
Thanks, Dave. That was really, really fascinating. I do have a couple questions. I've been taking notes as you've been talking and didn't want to, I know you welcomed interruptions, but it was all tying together so nicely, I was hesitant to do that. One question I have is, as a friend or a parent, sometimes we're confronted with feelings by a child or our friend that are true to the person, but untrue. For example, my thin friend might say, "I'm so fat." Mm-hmm. Or my child might say, "You don't love me because I can't have this piece of candy." How do we address those feelings? How do we validate those feelings but address what might be the underlying reason for those feelings?
Well, that's a great question, because it's amazing how many times that sort of a thing will come up. Is when what you're talking about is the negative self-talk that they're saying about themselves. What's interesting is what I say about you is always going to be more about me than it is you. And so it's really about how do we redirect and help them see, where does this message come from, and that sort of thing. If you try to contradict it, they will not hear it.
Right.
And I think that's a real important piece. So it's not about contradicting it. It's about just walking through the process and saying, so where is this coming from? And I'd like to learn more about it. And that and the point is another thing is, I'm saying, I hear you hate yourself. I hear, and there's some self-hatred here. I'm just wondering, where did that come from? I mean, I'm interested, and they might say, well, it came from you, and so this is the invitation, is just to walk with an open mind, without judgment or criticism, and not defend what they're saying. When you defend it, you validate it for them.
Right.
And so that's a real important piece, is just to stay as open and subjective as you can. Okay. It's interesting, many times I've had clients that will get upset and angry and want to attack me, if you will, from time to time, because I'm hitting on a nerve and it's one of these negative messages. And so I just, let them vent and give them the opportunity to feel it. And that's when things tend to shift, is when they do. And then they come back and are apologetic and that sort of thing, because then they've been able to see that it wasn't about me at all.
Okay. I also found interesting during your presentation, you talked about how, some self-help guidance involves repeating positive affirming, a message that I am strong, I'm healthy, I'm fast, I'm smart. Is it possible to visualize and to articulate enough that you rewire that insular cortex, or are you a firm believer that just won't work? Well, I've had a couple people say that it has been helpful and effective. So I don't want to say that it's not helpful or effective. Anything positive is better than negative. So I don't want to
throw any of that out. What I am saying, as far as long-term change, most people, it just doesn't create the change that they need or want.
Okay.
And so that being said, I don't want to say don't do it. I'm just saying, if you're really wanting to look at long-term change, you might want to dig into the feelings deeper at the same time. What I have found is that when we work through our feelings and really get to the core and essence of it on a particular issue, all of a sudden that pattern, that trigger that we have disappears. And now we don't get triggered. Over the next 3 to 6 months, that pattern disappears. And I and everyone else around me notices it. What's really interesting also is that everything about it, the feelings about it, are always honoring, loving, and respectful when we get to that point. Mm-hmm. That's what I've consistently seen with my clients. And what's interesting is criticism in that area disappears when that happens. And it isn't like we have this, euphoric, I'm just exuberant with life sort of thing, but we have a natural calming confidence, and that's there, that's positive and natural, and it's very different. And that's the piece that I'm saying. When people want to get to that different part, that's when, it's about digging into those feelings.
Okay. And my final question relates, we had an interesting conversation about self-help books prior to the webinar, and I enjoyed your explanation on why those don't typically work, and then how we choose the right support system to make real changes. If you wouldn't mind expanding on that, I think our listeners would enjoy that.
Okay. Well, self-help books, I wrote this book as a guide when people are ready. And the reason is while I've read many self-help books and I found them enjoyable and I could relate to them, it really didn't create any change in myself. And that's what I find is doing things on my own for an emotional level, it does not create the change. It's about how do I work with others and actually have my voice mm-hmm. with others, because our trauma has been created with the help or assistance of somebody or something else. And the way we are naturally wired is that we need to walk through this trauma with the help or assistance of somebody else. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be a counselor. It could be a friend. It could be a family member, although many times family members have a vested interest in things, and so going where you need to go might be more difficult. But once in a while, you have a really good objective family member, and so we don't want to, but it could be a coworker, it could be a pastor or priest, anyone that you feel safe enough to actually go to that emotional level and have the emotional expression that needs to come out to create the release. When that happens, you will know it, and the people around you will know it. And so with that in mind, that's where the self-help, it's just about, it helps ruminate inside of us, and it doesn't create any change.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more questions. Did you have any final thoughts for us?
I hope that this has been helpful for whoever is listening to this. It's just information and food to consider on when we really want to create change, how to do that. Also, I think it's an important piece. I do appreciate the education I got from at NAU, because it actually helped me be able to have the freedom and latitude to create this book, for example, because I didn't have the constraints of an agency telling me what to do or not to do. And so I appreciate that opportunity as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate your time today and your expertise, and I do think people will find it very helpful as a starting point to their own healing.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.